Hey everyone, it's Nancy Miller, the creator and host of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime, the mindful mystery show made for nighttime listening. And this is a teaser of our latest subscriber bonus episode, a September bonus called Trapped. And this episode is about, actually, it's better if you don't know what it's about because it was a big story with some shocking headlines. And I don't want to spoil the mystery, but I do want to encourage you to support Dead Sleep with a subscription. This show is independent and ad-free, and it always will be. So your money goes right back into making this show the best it can be. It's not content, it's collaboration. So check out a sample of the latest bonus and enjoy the full episode as a subscriber. Subscribe through Apple, Spotify, or Patreon and get your true crime for bedtime fix tonight. Good evening, and this is the September bonus episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. It's me, Nancy, and I want to thank you quickly for your support. You keep Dead Sleep independent and forever ad-free. Sometimes Dead Sleep stories benefit from a setup, a way to set the stage for the story you're about to hear. But for tonight's episode, less is more. Because this case, it made headlines when it first happened just about a year ago in October of 2023. And if I give you those headlines, it'll not only spoil the mystery. You might have already made up your mind about the person at the center. But the real story about what really happened, that just came out a couple of weeks ago. And it's different than what we were told from the headlines. Or at the very least, more nuanced. So the story you're going to hear tonight is all factual, just told in a dead sleep way. And I encourage you to check out the links, the key sources for this story, so you can get the full saga. I'll link to them in the show notes. And let's start this episode in a soothing and meditative way with this particular song, if you can call it a song. Sounds from a library of meditation music in this frequency. That's the sound waves that are supposed to have a soothing or restoring effect on the body. This particular track is 741 hertz, and it's called Releasing Darkness. I have no idea what kind of power it'll have on you, the power it might have on the mind for relaxation. But science or not, it's always nice to focus on a soothing sound and slow down your mind. It can make a difference, and it can inch you closer and closer to that place. A place where you feel safe and secure enough to surrender to sleep. And I wonder, what would have happened to a man named Joe Emerson if at one point, one weekend in October of 2023, if Joe had heard these tones from this meditation tune called Releasing Darkness, would things have turned out differently? Could all of this have been avoided if he'd just been able to get a good night's sleep? Because one weekend in October of 2023, a 44-year-old married father of two from the Bay Area in California named Joe Emerson. He hadn't slept a wink in 48 hours. How could he? He had to stay alert, vigilant. His life depended on it. He was somewhere in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, feeling trapped, lost in the darkness. And somewhere out there were a group of men he once thought of as his friends, who now wanted to kill him. He was sure of it. Out there somewhere in the dark, they lurked, getting ready to tear him to pieces like a pack of wolves. Over and over, he kept thinking to himself, is this a nightmare? Is this real? One thing he knew for certain: he was trapped, with no way to escape. The weekend wasn't supposed to turn out this way. It was supposed to be a guy's weekend, a weekend of relaxation, of good times, and hopefully a time of healing. The guys assembled were a small but tight-knit group. Most of them airline pilots, commercial pilots who'd known each other personally and professionally for years. They also shared a tragic bond, the loss of one of their own. The men were there that weekend in October of 2023 to honor a fellow pilot named Scott Pinney. Scott had died suddenly while jogging back in 2018. The cause of death was natural. It was a cardiac event. Scott had an undiagnosed heart condition, and while in Hawaii, Scott went for a run and collapsed. He was only 39 years old. Joe and Scott, they were best friends. They'd known each other since flight school, back in North Dakota. They were both trained to be pilots. Scott got a taste of Joe's love of running, and the two became running buddies. They especially loved running outdoors. Training to become a commercial pilot is mentally and physically demanding. So their bond, it was strong. They were a package deal. When Joe married his wife, Sarah, Scott was right there, the best man. Even when Joe and Sarah started their family and had 2 children, Joe didn't take his friendship with Scott for granted. When he was a kid, Joe struggled to make friends. He was sensitive and prone to crying when he was frustrated or overwhelmed, which made him an obvious target for bullies back in school. When Joe discovered his interest in aviation, that became his escape. He soon went from collecting model airplanes as a kid to learning how to fly planes himself. So for Joe, his career as a pilot was his passion and also his salvation. And his best friend Scott, he understood that. So when Scott died suddenly in 2018, Joe didn't know how to handle it. So he didn't deal with it right away. How could he? He had a busy life, wife, family, and a grueling schedule as a pilot for Alaska Airlines. Those of us who travel a lot by plane, we don't often think about the cockpit or the life of an airline pilot. Sure, there's the remote authority all the way in the front of the plane and an overall appreciation for their hard work. When we exit, we say thank you. But we don't have a window into what their schedules are like or what their lives are like. And for Joe, as much as he loved flying, it was intense. just when he thought he'd be home in time to see his family, something would always come up, an extra shift, which would set his schedule off for days and disappoint his family. Being a pilot can be lonely too. You travel at least half the month, and you spend a lot of time by yourself. It can be isolating and tedious. Joe eased that loneliness by going running in whatever city he was in. But after Scott died, it just felt different. And he began to manage his loneliness and his grief with drinking. He developed a special affinity for gin and tonics, Scott's favorite drink. When he was at home, Joe's wife Sarah noticed that Joe had changed. He seemed agitated, removed, depressed. So she recommended Joe see a therapist, which he did. When Joe saw the therapist, she agreed. Joe appeared to be suffering from depression, and one of the first steps he could take, perhaps, was going to a psychiatrist and getting a prescription for an antidepressant, an SSRI. Not necessarily long-term, but just something to lift the veil. According to the Center for Disease Control, millions of Americans take antidepressant medication, and it helps. For some, it makes a huge difference. But when the therapist suggested that to Joe, Joe shook his head, and he grew very serious. And he told the therapist, with a grim expression, "I can't do that." Did he know he needed the antidepressants? Yes. But could he actually get them and start taking them? That was more complicated. Because even though millions of Americans took this medication, Joe was a pilot. And when you are a pilot, there are a separate set of rules. Any medication Joe took to treat his depression would have to go through a special medical examiner who works under the FAA, that's the Federal Aviation Administration, a government agency that's part of the Department of Transportation, which makes sense. The FAA's job is to make sure that flying is safe for the millions and millions of people who do it every day. But it comes with some complications for the pilots themselves. Pilots like Joe Emerson. Establishing that he had a mental health issue would potentially cause him problems. It could stall his career. Because if he went to the medical examiner who worked under the FAA, they'd have to note it on his medical form, which could lead to him being decertified medically, which would mean he wouldn't be allowed to fly. At least he would be deferred. And deferment meant that until further notice, Joe would be grounded, not allowed to fly until he could be re-evaluated to ensure that he was mentally capable of flying a plane. And again, that makes perfect sense from one perspective. You want a mentally healthy pilot in the cockpit of your plane. The FAA apparently had an old school type of attitude with mental health, and they perceived someone suffering from depression and taking an SSRI as almost in the same category as someone who suffered from severe mental issues such as schizophrenia. Part of the problem was trying to measure mental health issues. Because mental health isn't quantifiable, each case was reviewed, one by one. It could take months for this medical paperwork to go through, which meant it could take up to a year for a pilot to be waiting to find out if he could be approved to fly while taking an antidepressant. And Joe couldn't afford that because it meant getting half a salary. And again, it meant you'd be stalled from moving up at just about every commercial airline. So Joe decided to do what fellow pilots did all the time, it seems. He kept his problem to himself. He saw a therapist on the side, but didn't take the antidepressants. One could, I suppose, take the antidepressants and just not tell the FAA. But that wasn't Joe's style. A lot of pilots, like Joe, they're rule followers, which is a good thing. They're not going to lie on a form. And this wasn't just an ethical, moral dilemma, it was a legal one too. Because if it was discovered that you lied about your health on a form, you could be fined up to $250,000 and face criminal charges. Joe decided to white-knuckle it, work it out for himself. Pilots are mentally strong. He could get through this. He would simply choose to focus on his family, focus on his career, and not think about the death of his best friend. He would deal with his grief later. It'd be fine. Everything's fine. If you know anything about grief, and eventually we all will, you'll know, grief doesn't work like that. It doesn't get put on a shelf like a canned good that you'll decide to open in a few years when you're ready. No, if grief were a canned good, it would be more like that prank, that practical joke with the mixed nuts, and when you open up the can, 3 snakes come flying out, scaring the crap out of you and everyone around you. That, to me, is what grief is more like. Especially if you've tried to push it down and not deal with it, like it seemed that Joe was trying to do. So back to this weekend in October of 2023. This seemed like just what Joe needed. A getaway with his buds to relax, be in nature, and have a good time. The men were staying on a vast property that was owned by Scott's father. Since Scott had passed away, Joe had become close with Scott's dad. And so for that weekend, Scott's dad and his other pilot friends decided to stay for the weekend in a yurt on acres and acres of beautiful Washington State wilderness. It was paradise for these guys. You could hike, run, enjoy the fresh air, have a campfire, kick back a few drinks, and relax. Everything was going well. Gin and tonics, Scott's favorite drink. Everyone was having a good time. And then someone in the group had an idea. And they introduced something, an X factor. One that would change everything.